It always comes back to progressive overload. Whatever style of training that you perform, whatever split that you choose to do, high reps, high volume, low volume, fast reps, slow reps, at the end of the day, at some point, it comes back to trying to add more weight to the bar. In this video, I'm going to be discussing progressive overload in quite some detail. This is going to be an extremely valuable video for natural lifters, and if you can follow the tips that I provide here, it will enable you to build more muscle over a longer period of time. Now, there is a possibility that you can gain muscle mass without technically improving your paper strength. And what I mean by paper strength is your logbook strength, the numbers. And sometimes it's easy to get caught up in that, and it can be a little bit misleading. So this happens because of the following. Increasing the stimulus placed upon a target muscle above and beyond what was consistently placed upon it beforehand, i.e. capitalising on rushed reps, improper execution, range of motion issues, and in some cases poor exercise selection. So the numbers on paper might drop, but the stimulus presented to a target muscle can actually increase, therefore leading to growth. But then after some time, it comes back to strength progression. And if you were to go back and perform that movement that you've been working on with stricter form, more range of motion over the past, let's say 12 weeks, go back and perform it in the same manner as you used to, inevitably after some time, you'll be lifting more weight than you were beforehand. So really, is it ever about anything other than trying to increase the true and honest strength of a target muscle mass? Now, with that in mind, putting genetic structural differences aside, muscle mass will generally correlate to strength most of the time if the following three factors are considered during progressive overload. Number one is picking the right exercise that successfully stimulates the target muscle. There's no good progressively overloading an exercise if that stimulus from that overload isn't being placed upon the muscle that you want. And we use the following example. It's really obvious: high bar squat and low bar squat. You've got two lifters over a 2-year period, both of them add 30k to their 5 rep max, let's say. One guy does the high bar, one guy does the low bar. We come back after 2 years and we have a look at their quads. Both of them want bigger legs, but the low bar squatter has noticed that their growth has been lackluster in comparison because most of the stimulus that they've been presenting to their lower body because of the low bar squats is on the hips, the glutes and the lower back. Whereas the high bar squatter predominantly has focused most of that stimulus from the progressive overload on the quads. Another example would be the bench press. Whilst it's a fantastic exercise, it may not be best suited for everyone. If you have very dominant shoulders or very dominant triceps, for example, you may progressively overload that bench press, but you might not find that it gives you the kind of the look and the increase in size on the chest that you were hoping for. So all that energy, all that grind, all that increasing strength may have been better placed on another movement. So that's the first point. The exercise selection is very important. Just as a quick reminder, you can grab a completely free copy of my 4 times a week bulking routine. The link for the Google Sheet template will be in the description box down below, as will be the link to the video that explains that program. Number 2 is exercise form needs to be consistent. There's no good trying to chase paper improvements in strength on the logbook and artificially boosting that up by reducing your range of motion, by speeding up reps, by adding maybe a bounce at the bottom, stretch reflex, when you're pressing where there wasn't any in the first place, squirming and wiggling your way to try and find any means possible to get that weight up and artificially inflate it. Okay, your strength on paper's gone up, but that has not provided any surplus of stimulus to that target muscle, and that's really important. And that's especially difficult on back training. It's really quite difficult indeed for most lifters because it's not as easy as, say, a press. A press, you finished a press when you're locked out. It's much easier to be consistent, much easier for the form to be reliable. On back training, it's different because that range of motion can drop just little by little each and every week as you kind of overzealously, over-aggressively push that weight up. So that's something you have to bear in mind. You need to be really disciplined with back training in particular, I found, to make sure that that strength paper increase actually places more stress on the target muscle rather than just inflating those numbers artificially. And thirdly, again, it comes back down to exercise selection, making sure that the exercise selection is good so that the progressive overload you're doing is actually increasing true and honest contractile ability strength on that muscle mass. Say, for example, the clean and press, as good of an exercise as it is, great bang for your buck, it's not really that good for increasing progressive overload to warrant or as a means to grow bigger muscles, because there's a lot of kinetic energy involved, there's a lot of momentum, and there's a lot of stress being placed on other muscles that help out that movement. So you increase your clean and press by 50 kilos over a year, let's say. Are your shoulders going to be dramatically bigger? Perhaps not, because there's so many other variables going into that. Whereas if you were to choose a seated shoulder press, then if you were to increase your press, let's say by 25 kilos, it's going to produce much more noticeable gains in size, because that overload is directly increasing the stimulus placed upon that target muscle each and every session that you do. So that's very important, making sure your exercises aren't based on kinetic energy or momentum. Your cheat curls, another example, great exercise. I love cheat curls, but it's probably not the best one to rely solely on as a progressive exercise, progressive overload movement, because obviously you can, use more hip thrust each and every week that you train it. You can take the weight up, but you might not necessarily be increasing the stimulus on that bicep. So you can, use that movement in conjunction with other exercises that are going to be much stricter, whereby the increase in progressive overload, more load on the bar equals more stress or more stimulus on that target muscle. Okay, so setting the standard, it's really important to understand just how much you can overload a certain movement over a period of time. And I think people are generally too overzealous, really kind of hyper aggressive with the jumps that they can make, and this inevitably leads to burnout, backwards progression, and then inevitably they'll become frustrated and then move on to another kind of trend or style of training. So if you think about it this way, let's say you can increase the strength on a movement, your bench press, for example, by 1 kilo each month. Now, it doesn't seem like a lot. A lot of people would turn their nose up at that. But if you can do that every month for a year, that's 12 kilos. If you can repeat that for 3 years straight, that's 36 kilos on your bench press. Now, how many of you guys have added 36k to your bench over the last 3 years? Probably not that many. It's a good amount of weight. Let's say you were lifting 80 kilos before for a set of 5. You're now doing 116 kilos, for a set of 5. That's a good solid increase. So being realistic with the gains in strength, being patient, and using the smallest increments possible, essentially, to guarantee success. The disparity between the progressive overload that you can see from exercise to exercise, that's really important to consider as well. And oftentimes I'll get this, people will be mystified as to why they're not, increasing their strength on the dumbbell lateral raise. If you think about that 1k increment to that dumbbell, technically speaking, most people are going to be using 8 to 16 kilos on the dumbbell side lateral raise. Let's say 12 kilos, 1 kilo on that is going to be more than 10%, isn't it? It's going to be 15% or so. That's a good chunk of weight. There's no way that you're going to add that every week or every few weeks. It's going to take a long time, guys. So understanding the percentage differences, look at the total amount of weight used, the increment that you're taking it up, and that percentage will give you a rough idea as to how quickly you can increase that weight on that movement. A barbell squat or a leg press is going to go up much more quickly and by much larger jumps than your small movements. Also something to consider with the dumbbells, sometimes they're not the best tool for good, honest, progressive overload. You may have to stay at a weight much longer because of the increments being only 2 or generally 2.5 kilos between the next dumbbell. And again, I'll touch on that in a little bit on another point. Too much fluff can really get in the way and spoil good progressive overload. Too much volume will muddy the waters and accumulate fatigue, essentially. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to make progress. It's just harder to express that strength that, true strength that you have if you're fatigued. And I think, the trend lately, especially on like TikTok and stuff, is this kind of low volume, low rep stuff to avoid fatigue at all costs. Fatigue's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that you'll be unable to express that increase in strength that you can get. So try to cut out the fluff and really get to the bread and butter of what you're trying to achieve with a program. Pick fewer exercises and you'll see obviously much better jumps up in terms of your progress week to week, because you haven't got all the other rubbish kind of weighing it down and increasing the fatigue on a certain muscle. So that's really important. Now, high volume does work, but it won't be obvious until after that period of time. I'm going to use a great example here, which I spoke about before, Smolov Jr. So I've done this for squats probably 3 times now, and it's a 3-week mesocycle. We're essentially doing a lot of volume at a very high intensity. So there are 4 squat days per week. I think it's 4x9, 5x7, 7x5, and 10x3. So as you can imagine, a massive amount of fatigue. It's really, really hard to get through. You'll be lucky if you don't get injured. I'll put it like that. But once all is said and done, you'll notice a massive increase in strength, even though every single squat session you did felt like hell, and you weren't really able to perform at your best. But after 4 or 5 days rest at the end of that, you're able to then see the gains in strength that you've made. If you do that test, that 1 rep max test after that Smolov, maybe 1 or 2 days after finishing the program, you're actually going to go backwards. You're going to see no increase in strength because of the accumulation of fatigue. So that's the point I'm trying to make. It doesn't necessarily mean high volume is bad. It just means that it can muddy the waters, confuse you, and prevent you from expressing the necessary gains that you would have achieved during your progressive overload. So low volume is more reliable, it's clear, consistent gains in strength can be seen more frequently essentially than high volume. So upping the weight too fast and chasing it too aggressively, it's hard to keep form consistent, especially on back training. I touched on this before. This is a really important point because often, even myself, I get carried away with this. It's much harder to keep that consistent than, say, your chest press. So just try to remember that increasing your paper strength is one thing, but whether that actually manifests itself as an increase in the stress placed upon a muscle because of that jump up in weight is another thing entirely. So just try to be patient. Don't chase the numbers too aggressively, because I guarantee you it will come back and it will bite you on the bottom later on. It won't work. So another big problem that affects progressive overload is letting the reps drop too low. Let's say your target rep range is 5 to 7, and you chase a little bit too aggressively and you end up in a scenario where you're doing 3 or 4 reps. Now you're in a little bit of a sticky situation here. You either have to lighten the load or you have to wait, and you might have to wait a long time, because if you think about it logically, to increase from 3 to 4 reps is significantly harder and relies on a much larger increase in strength than going from, say, 6 to 7 reps or even 8 to 9 reps. The higher up the reps you go, the easier it is to see an increase, because it obviously represents a smaller percentage of your overall 1 rep max. So it might take a month for you to go from, say, 3 to 4 reps. It might take longer. But that means 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks of consistently seeing the same number on paper. Now, that's not very good, mentally. It's difficult to motivate yourself to do that, and it's very difficult not to fall into the trap without that kind of knowledge of knowing what's happening and thinking that you're just stalling. You may not be stalling, you may be getting stronger, but it's just not quite enough strength required to add that extra rep. Let's say you're squatting 150 kilos, to go from 3 to 4 reps might warrant a 7.5k increase in your 1 rep max potentially. And that is going to take time. So you can be improving strength very consistently and incrementally each week, but you can't see that on paper. You can't express that strength on paper, unfortunately. Plus, when your reps are too low, there's more risk of injury. There's more risk of psychological burnout, probably more so. It's very, very difficult and taxing. So understanding that you might, need to spend a long period of time on a weight if your reps are too low. It's better to keep them slightly higher just to allow for more consistent progress. That's something to bear in mind as well. Don't be tempted to increase too fast because the reps might drop down too low as you do that. Another really important point that massively mucks people up and frustrates them so inevitably they stop doing progressive overload is not understanding how lifestyle can impact strength performance and how it affects the way that you express your strength. It doesn't mean you've gone backwards if you've had a bad week. It just might mean that the variables leading up to that session were not effectively managed. Ideally we enter the gym with the same kind of variables leading up to that session each and every workout that we have. The same number of steps the day before, the same amount of sleep, the same amount of food, the same kind of emotional stress. But in the real world, it's not like that. And there are going to be weeks that you go into the gym, in a worse place than the week prior, for example. And it doesn't necessarily mean that your workout's going to be worse. It's just understanding that and preparing for that and knowing that if your rep drops on that movement, there's probably a reason for that, rather than getting disheartened and frustrated and then kind of move into an inferior kind of way of training because of frustration. So it's just really important to understand how that can affect it. And it might take a few cycles, weeks of training for you to kind of come back round to where all those variables are kind of in the same place they were on that really good week last week where you increased your strength. Especially if you're doing shift work, for me, for example, it might be that I have to wait 3 weeks for the variables to align to create that kind of perfect, atmosphere and environment for me to then increase that performance from my previous bests. Doesn't mean that all the other weeks I've been slacking or I've wasted. It's just that because of the fatigue or because of this reason or less sleep, it's meant that I can't really express that. So just understand that, please, and be aware of that, and you'll have a much better, much less stressful time when it comes to progressive overload. So again, not using body weight to your advantage. Now, this is the big one at the moment. There's this big kind of science push towards bulking and how it's not really that effective. The easiest way to increase your strength is by increasing body weight. Mass moves mass. There's a reason why there are weight classes in sports, competitive sports, lifting sports. It works. The difference is that you shouldn't abuse it, especially if at some point you want to drop body fat and get shredded or look lean. You're making more work for yourself. But if managed sensibly, it can be a fantastic and viable tool to act as a catalyst to push your weight up on the movements. And if you're doing everything else right and you then add body weight to that, you're going to see fantastic success in the gym and really see some good gains as a result of that. You just need to know when to stop, how much to increase weight by over a period of time so you don't get carried away and it doesn't start then to negatively affect you, which it can. As much as you might not want to, it may be necessary to add more body weight to overcome that plateau that you might have been stuck on for some time. First and foremost, if you're not making progress in the gym, if your numbers aren't going up, have a look at your programming, kind of really analyse that, put pen to paper and maybe make some tweaks there. Then look at your food intake. And if your programming is good and you were making progress before but you're not now, you just may need to add more food. It's as simple as that. You just try not to get carried away with it where you're essentially cheating your way to new progress on paper. If you don't mind gaining lots and lots of body fat, then that's fine. Go away and do it. So we're going to have a quick look now at 2 progression schemes. The double progression scheme, obviously very popular. You increase reps and then weight. So you work within a rep range, let's say hypothetically 6 to 8 reps. Your bench press is 90k for 6. You grind at that for a number of weeks until you can do 8 reps. Once you do, you then take the weight up by 5 kilos. Your reps then drop back down to say 6, for example, and then you go round again. And you just rinse and repeat. So reps up, weight up, reps down. And that's the cycle that you do. However, if the reps are low, it comes back to the point that I made earlier, it can be a little bit demotivating sometimes performing the same rep at a weight, for a couple of weeks in a row. And this will happen if you're doing low rep sets, 5 or 6, for example. You just might not have quite enough strength to express that extra rep, but you may still be getting a little bit stronger, and it might take 2 or 3 weeks to then get that rep, 6 to 7 at 85 kilos, for example. As long as you know that and you're aware of that, then that's great. But if you're not, it can be very, very demotivating, and it puts a lot of people off. It turns a lot of people off progressive overload and makes people prematurely change their routine. The other way, which is slightly more motivational, I would say, probably slightly more reliable, would be to use mini plates. So you're working within a very small rep range, or 1 rep, give or take maybe a rep. Let's say, your target is 6 on the bench press. And instead of then waiting to up the reps to 8 or 9, you keep the reps the same, but add very, very small increments of weight each week using mini plates. So 0.25 aside for an extra 0.5 kilos on the bar every week. Now, while you may not be strong enough to express, that extra rep from 6 to 7 reps, as I said, but you might be strong enough to go up that 0.5 kilos. So essentially you're bridging the gap between, where you would usually get stuck on traditional progressive overload schemes. And this way you can kind of increase that weight, keep the reps the same, but at least you're just that little bit better than you were last week. It's something that's tangible, something that's on paper that you can see. So it's a lot more motivational, a lot more rewarding. And I think generally you're going to kind of stick on progressive overload for a lot longer by doing it that way. Now, don't get me wrong, with both techniques, you will stall at some point. It's guaranteed. There's going to be periods of time we don't really see results, because of variables or what have you. You have to remain patient. You have to, understand that this process takes time. You're not going to see fantastic results overnight. You have to put the grind in. Have a look at your programming. Have a look at the variables leading up to that programming, your food intake and the progressive system that you're using. And I'm sure, over a period of time, you'll see some fantastic results. So that's pretty much the video, guys. If you enjoyed it or found it valuable, please let me know. Please like the video, subscribe to see more. Any ideas for future videos, let me know in the comment section below. And don't forget as well, as I said before, the free 4-day-a-week bulking routine in the description box below, as well as the video that explains that. Thanks for watching and stay strong.